Good morning, everyone. Buenos días. I know there are people from Latin America in the room, maybe others also following, but the panel will be conducted in English. Thank you for coming. My name is Eduardo Suarez. I'm the head of editorial at the Reuters Institute. Our mission at the Institute is to explore the future of journalism around the world. So this is a panel that is absolutely on mission for us. It was proposed by the good friends of Radio Ambulante, and I was really, really happy to be here chairing it because, you know, these are three women journalists from the region that I admire, and that they are doing really great work in covering a region that is so diverse and so full of nuances. And I think that's some of the things that we are going to be discussing today. Latin America is a very important region in terms of journalism, and in terms of how journalism is consumed is quite special in the sense that it is a very young continent, so a lot of young audiences, and also news are usually consumed through mobile phones and through social networks, and that introduces, you know, some challenges for us as journalists. So again, something that we will be discussing today. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce the speakers. At the end, you see Maria Teresa Ronderos. Is an award-winning journalist from Colombia. Many of you will know Maria Teresa, I'm sure. She's now the co-founder and editor of Clip, which is an investigative outlet focusing on doing cross-border investigations in Latin America and beyond. It was founded in 2019, I think, and they have done 22 projects with 90 media partners, which is really, really impressive. Then here's Silvia Vinas. Silvia is the executive producer of El Hilo. Maybe some of you listen to El Hilo. It's a wonderful weekly podcast produced by Radio Ambulante. They have produced 155 episodes, which is a lot, and they have around 8 million downloads, I think, which is super impressive. If you haven't listened, I really recommend. And finally, here's Alejandra Sanchez Inzunza. She's a Mexican journalist. She's the founder of Dromomanos, which is a production company doing journalistic projects in Latin America. They launched in 2011, so a long time ago. They have 10 team members, and they are covering Latin America, you know, working with 60 media partners, you know, news organizations like El País, Vice, El Universal, Efecto Cocuyo, El Faro, Piauí, many news organizations in the region that we all know. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. There will be time for questions at the end, but I would like to start, you know, asking our panelists. Obviously, Latin America is such a diverse continent. You know, something happening in Colombia is very different from Mexico or Argentina or Brazil. So, you know, what would be your advice, you know, to you know, people who are watching here or online, you know, in approaching the region? Maybe we can start with Maria Teresa. What do you think, you know, global news organizations or foreign news organizations should be taking into account with approaching this continent?
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here, and thank you to Radio Ambulante for having thought of this panel. What I think is, I think it's good to listen to Latin Americans. It's good to follow some of the, you know, cross-border international, of course, Clip, which I am, of course, advertising right now, but all the others, like El Hilo, Radio Ambulante, like Dromomanos, like many other news outlets that are producing information from Latin America, from the Latin American point of view, if you could say that. Sometimes it's difficult for international media to cover Latin America because we all have like a view of things from the outside, and I think it's very interesting, for example, sometimes to read El País, because El País America, that has now become, because El País America is a mixture of seeing Latin America from the outside, but at the same time covered by Latin Americans. So it's like you have the best of both worlds. Of course, there's superb international journalism about Latin America, and sometimes international journalists can see things we cannot see. But what we want, what we do, and what we would love more people to look, is to see the structural and common patterns. So you see it is very diverse. What you say is true, Eduardo, but it's also, there are some structural problems that are actually affecting the whole region, or some international bad actors that are actually harming the whole region. And I think we have to identify these actors, identify these structural problems, and see what's common in all this region, because it's the only way we can start to address it. And sometimes problems cannot be solved in the country, inside the country, but precisely because there are too many international influences. So if you actually see them and make them visible, then it becomes easier to understand the problems.
And of course, that's something that you guys at CLIP have done very well. And I would like you to walk us through, for example, one of the projects that you have done, basically trying to identify those problems across the region and how they are playing out in different countries. It would be nice, yeah.
So one of the problems that we've covered different problems. Basically, we follow like 4 lines of investigation. One that has to do with freedom. So we've done some projects. We just published one about when freedom of expression or freedom of the press has been violated. We try to sum all the efforts to cover that and expose that. But one of the projects we did recently that was really interesting was to understand how repression worked and what were the weapons of mass repression in Latin America, because we had massive protests throughout the continent in the year before the pandemic started, like 2019, and then after, during the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, massive protests. And they were very, very badly repressed in many countries, and many people died, and we wanted to understand then why arms that do no harm, how do you do that in English?
Non-lethal.
Non-lethal or less lethal weapons supposedly are there to protect those protests so that there are no killings. And it didn't work. So what's happening? So we went out and we did this amazing cross-border investigation in which things that we found in Brazil, for example, that the police had been sold by the big company in Brazil that sells these types of weapons. They sold it to the police and they had defects. They were not working well. And this same lot of weapons was sold to Chile for repression. And the actual senator, Fabiola, she was one of the victims probably of this weapon, even though the thing is still on trial. So we were able to actually show who are the big sellers, who are the intermediaries, how this is a completely responsible business that sells weapons to all kinds of intermediaries, some of them completely with a terrible record, like in Argentina, there was one of them was convicted for crimes against humanity, and he became an arms dealer in between. And these are arms that are supposedly produced to protect citizens at moments of big disruption. So these are the kinds of things we do. Another big story that had a lot of impact had to do with migrants going through Latin America from Asia and Africa and crossing all Latin America to get to the US and Canada. And we were able to really understand how it worked, who were pushing them, from which countries they were coming, what was their ordeal, try to find a lot of the people they had lost. There were some people who died and nobody cared. So we tried to find them and find their relatives, people from Congo, people from Democratic Republic of Congo, and also people from Cameroon and other places. And then finally we did a big story that also had impact, which has to do, we did 2 big collaborations surrounding churches. and crime, and crossing how a lot of the churches are being used to money laundering, or are being used to manipulate political biases and to impose political narratives, and how they do it, and how there's a transnational effort at that time from the White House, when it was Trump in the White House, pushing that narrative into Central American countries, particularly, but also Brazil and Argentina. So those are the kinds of stories we're doing. We find a company like MECO in Costa Rica, and then we find how it had been a very corrupt company in one place, and how it had been acting in other countries. So we follow the trail. The same with Odebrecht, these kinds of international sort of cronyism and corruption. We can also expose it, because what we saw is one company could be a terrible actor and even put in jail and everything, or prosecuted in a country, and then in the next country they go afresh and they can do whatever they want, and nobody knows what happened in the next country. You would say, oh, but everybody should know that this guy was under a lot of scrutiny in Costa Rica. And no, we found out that he had been given tons of contracts in Colombia without anybody really saying anything about it. So that's the kind of things that we want to expose, no? So that the bad actors are stopped and they cannot just move one country to the other.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it was touched in all the panels, how these bad guys are actually transnational and they operate in many countries, and sometimes journalists are not collaborating across countries, so it's great that your project exists, of course, Maria Teresa. And I wanted to ask Alejandra, because you've been covering the region now for 11 years or so, or 12 years, what have you learned about Latin America while doing these long-form projects for Dromomanos that you didn't know before, and maybe what advice you would give to people approaching the region from afar?
This one? Okay. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for Radio Ambulante for organizing this panel, and it's such an honor to be with my colleagues here. Well, Dromomanos is like a very sui generis thing. It started with two reporters traveling all over Latin America for 2 years, trying to understand how does drug trafficking affects each country. Because sometimes as Mexicans or as Colombians, we are very focused in our own main issues because it's so dramatic, like drug war in our countries is so dramatic that we have no idea of what is happening in Panama with money laundering or with production countries like Peru or Bolivia. So our idea was to do like the best spirit of journalism, that is go on the ground and understand what's happening. And that founded something very, I think it was very special for us, like to understand the region that way. And now what we are doing is the same thing, but working in alliance with other media outlets, with local journalists, with freelance journalists, with traditional or independent media, like all kind of people that understand the region, but to try to give it a regional and international point of view in the main, not just in drug trafficking, like we are now focusing like the main issues that for us are the most dramatic nowadays, that it's authoritarianism, climate change, and of course violence and drug policy. So I think to start like that, like freelance journalists just covering now, help us a lot to understand better the problems, to not repeat what is happening, but also to learn a lot from our colleagues, like from local journalists that are in risk, because we are one of the most dangerous regions in the world for being journalists, and to learn from them and to respect their work and to help them also to be in other places, like that, to be published in international media outlets, because that's how we work. We are not like a media, we publish our own investigations, but also we work with BAIS, with El País, with different media that can also give more exposure to the topics that we are covering. So, well, that's what we learned, that the importance of working with local journalists, I think it's the most important thing. And also for your first question, like for international journalists covering the region, I think the main thing that they have to do is to talk to, but not just as fixers, because that's also a problem that's happening in the region, like this colonial point of view, and but to understand, because I learned from El Salvador thanks to Carlos Dada. I learned from Colombia thanks to Maria Teresa, and that kind of, that's super important to represent in the work we do. I don't know if I'm talking too much.
So. No, it's really interesting, of course, Alejandra.
And we did a project together with Dromomanos that was called The Addictive War, and I recommend it because it really found the stories of why these drug policies letting us nowhere. No?
And that's also an amazing thing. It's like we have collaborated with El Hilo, with Clip, and it's like, I think that when you are covering a region and you are doing transnational journalism, you have to work with other people that are doing the same thing, that you don't compete anymore. It's like now it's collaborative, and that's the only way to do this kind of journalism, and that's beautiful also.
Of course. Well, Silvia, I wanted to talk to you, as the final person in this first round, because obviously your project is a bit different. I mean, it's a weekly podcast. I mean, Maria Teresa and Alejandra are more focused like on long-form investigations, and the rhythms of a weekly podcast are much more demanding, I guess, right? And I wanted to know, I mean, how do you guys decide, the topics that you deal with, the kind of stories that you go for, also taking into account that Radio Ambulante is also doing their own work. So I want you to know a bit more about the process that you follow for each episode.
Okay. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for having us. So I think it starts with our team. We have a Latin American team, right? So
how many countries are you based on?
Well, let's see, Uruguay, Venezuela, Mexico, I'm in the UK, Colombia, yes, we're all over. And I think that really helps because we have an editorial meeting every Thursday to pick the episode for not the next day, of course, but the Friday of the next week. And it's extremely useful to have a team with a Latin American view that they sort of have an intuition of what is too local and what would work for an audience that is regional and actually global. We have listeners in Europe, we have listeners everywhere. So I think that's like the first step. When we hire people, we ask them to pitch, what would you cover this week? And then that gives us like an idea of how they think about the region. But we do a mixture of, the most important news of the week, which is very hard to tell because in Latin America, so many things are going on. Sometimes it's very obvious. But there are weeks where lots of things are going on, but there's not a major thing. So we look for stories that we see that will have themes, cross-border themes, like climate change, which was mentioned, authoritarianism, drug policy, and things that we want to dive deep into, and that maybe don't get a lot of attention. So, for example, last week we covered Haiti, and we covered the multiple crises there, but especially the gang violence that is taking over the capital. And another example so we launched Radio El Hilo March 2020, and we all know what happened. We had been piloting and preparing a year earlier, but the pandemic was like the topic. And
do you think that helped you guys or the opposite?
I mean, I guess it helped because it was like, well, we have to cover this, but it was also how do we cover it? And because it was completely new, like if you remember early on, like we didn't know what was safe. We were washing our groceries kind of thing, So it was that time. And so we were preparing kind of a more evergreen episode about initiatives in Latin America to, to be able to, to deal with the shortages that we have in Latin America. But we had an editorial meeting, and we had seen that week, there was a lot of news about Guayaquil in Ecuador and how the city was collapsing. There was no space in hospitals, no space in morgues, and it was terrible. And it was the first really Latin American city to see that and to live that. And we thought, you know what, let's change plans. We do this a lot last minute, and focus on this, because it was like a warning. This is what can come to the rest of the region, because we share the same issues in all countries. And I think that's our third episode, and it's still one of my favorite and one of the ones that I'm most proud of, because we were able to make that change and use the network that we have with Radio Ambulante and the rest of our team, our colleagues. My co-host Eliezer Budasov, worked for New York Times en Español, Etiqueta Negra, so, and Daniela Alarcón, of course. So we have all this network that we can tap into, Dromomanos, to get those local voices, as we were saying, to explain what is going on in these countries.
Yeah, that's a great point, and obviously the pandemic was like the mother of all transnational stories. It was a worldwide story, but there's another one in the region that has been mentioned before now, which is authoritarianism, and how press freedom threats are rising in the region in different ways. Obviously there are obvious dictatorships like Cuba, Nicaragua, and others, but also in democratic countries like Mexico, like El Salvador, like Guatemala. We are seeing journalists in jail, news organizations leaving, as El Faro last week. And I don't know, what are the strategies, especially for media organizations like CLIP or Dromomanos, that are actually more on the ground and covering stories. What are the strategies that you think journalists should take, to defend themselves, to try to address these problems? Sometimes it's like real threats, death threats. Sometimes it's more like, politicians harassing you and, calling you out from their press conferences. I don't know. Maybe Maria Teresa can start with this.
I think there are like three things that journalists do, and we try to promote this a lot. One is to work to make your environment as secure as you can. To really know how to work securely from your computer, from the way you work, from the way you deal with life. You have to be aware of the risk. And not become paranoid or anything like that, but a little bit of paranoia is really, really important to work, because if you are going to get into this difficult thing, for example, the story of Rafael, the Rafael project that we worked together with Forbidden Stories, and for example, we went to the actual place where things happened. We had to take a lot of precautions to go there. You cannot just go there like happily, go luckily, and then get into trouble. The second thing is collaboration. We are doing a lot of collaboration, and I'm sure Alejandra and you and Silvia, you know this very well, with people that couldn't possibly publish on their own name in their own country, because then they would be put in jail or prosecuted or forced into exile. So they collaborate. We do stories together, and we just have like a generic signature so that people can actually publish. And I've practiced that in Colombia, where we had a very terrible era of journalists being killed. A lot of our colleagues from the regions, we worked together, and we would do the stories together, but it would be like the big media outlet in Bogota would sign, and this would protect them, but still they could get their stories out. And I think the third thing that we have, and this is why I think CLIP exists in a way, is to fight back. It's not just a matter of protect yourself, resist, and be super careful. It's also about finding the sources of that authoritarianism and going after those who are producing that kind of narratives. What we're doing, and we've been doing now for about a year and a half, is covering this information. I think a lot of this authoritarianism comes from narratives that are being falsely and fakely produced massively in Latin America and in the rest of the world. But in Latin America, it has become really strong. Some come from the left, some come from the right, if there's a left and a right, I no longer know. But they're all promoting confusion so that people can then resort to the savior, who is whoever, Bukele, or in one end of the ideology or the other end, it would be, I don't know, Maduro or whatever. So I do think that getting together to investigate who is producing this disinformation, why, and which machines, who is making money with that, how is this being produced? I think those are the three things. Be safe and work safely, collaborate, and think of how you join forces when you cannot publish in your own country. Don't run risks that are really not necessary if you can do it with somebody else, and lower risks. And the third, fight back, investigate, get together to do the investigations that are difficult.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, we are seeing a lot of propaganda and disinformation in Latin America around Russia and around the war in Ukraine. We published recently a piece by Gretel Kang, which is a Panamanian journalist who works for us. And again, something that we are seeing across the region, we're seeing also in Africa and in other places, and good to take care of that. Alejandra, I mean, obviously you are from Mexico. Mexico has a president that almost every day, talks and says very nice things about journalists from his daily press conference. What is your experience and the experience of your colleagues of being journalists in Mexico at this particular time? We know from the Reuters Institute's data that trusting news in Mexico has gone down a lot since López Obrador is president. And we think that it has to do somehow with the kind of things that he says against journalists in a country where many journalists are being killed every day.
Yeah, sorry. Again, yeah. It's a very sad situation, what is happening, because freedom of expression is reducing a lot. And not just in Mexico, I think actually it's more dramatic in other places, like in Central America. We are all the time helping journalists we work with that are starting to exile or having really terrible threats. But the thing is that with these kind of leaders, like Bukele, Andrés Manuel or Bolsonaro, it's like they copy each other, the strategies, and it's like they're bad ideas. They think, oh, that's amazing, we're gonna do it here.
Exactly.
The thing that we can do, I agree totally with Maria Teresa, is like to collaborate and create safety nets to protect each other. Mexico is really complex because the threats comes from the state, but also from organized crime. So the mixture between them is really confusing. So you never know who is coming for them.
Yeah.
But the truth is that it's the state most of the times. Like organized crime is like if your president doesn't respect the work that journalists do, then for crime it's very easy to kill journalists. It's like they don't matter. And what he's doing now in Mexico is to monopolize information and the production of information. And for example, it's not that it was good, but we had like a state agency of information, Notimex. And it wasn't good. It was very captured by the government. But now it doesn't exist anymore because we have a daily conference in which the president says what's the reality of the country. So he says, like, we don't need any media anymore because I'm here, I'm talking, and that's crazy and that's really riskful. And the thing that we can do, and even for me, like, well, we work regionally. We are based in Mexico, but we work all over the region. But the main issue that the people that are more at risk are local journalists in the States, like not people in Mexico City, not even in Guadalajara, no, like people that are all day reporting, and they are visible, and the crime knows them, and the politics knows them. So the safety nets that we have to do is for them. It's like for me, even though I have reported organized crime all over the country, I'm always leaving.
Yeah, you leave.
I'm not there. So I think that to create this kind of connections, we have now, this we are doing actually in Central America, but we have one project called Redacción Regional, that it's in alliance with independent media partners, small media partners like Contracorriente in Honduras and Divergentes in Nicaragua. And Divergentes is working totally in exile. No one is in Nicaragua. So what we are trying to do with them is, like, first, we have the funding. Like, we in Mexico have the funding because we now they are also, like, these authoritarian governments are doing laws to forbid international organizations to give money to independent media or civil society. So that's one thing that, well, we receive them, and in Mexico that's not that bad, but it could be. Because the thing is that there are ideas to do the same thing, but until now it hasn't happened. So first we receive the funding, and we help them producing stories. When they have to get out of the country because of the production of the stories, they come to our house. We don't have, like, an official house, but there's a house. And the Dromomanos house is called. And we have, so they can stay safe and publish and measure the risk before coming back. And about fighting back, we are also, like, developing, we are studying it now in alliance with some data-driven journalists and other kind of people, because that's not our expertise, of course. Our expertise is on the ground, but like technologies, and it's important to start working with people that know other things that you don't. And we're trying to understand, like, digital violence, because digital violence produces exiles and produces deaths. And it's like, if Bukele says that Juan Martinez, an amazing journalist, is a gang member, he can be killed. So, well, the first thing that we do in that case is, Juan, get outside El Salvador, come with us. And it's like, even though we are not an NGO and there are other people that do that kind of things, it's like, we as journalists first is like to have common sense and what are we doing. And then it's like to start developing some kind of tool. I don't know if a bot or something, we are working on that. It's like, I hope next year I will have some news about that. But it's like, how can we do to contrarrestar? To counter, yeah, to counter this kind of violence and these machines, because it's crazy, no? The kind of the amount of money and people working for disinformation, for misinformation, and to divide and polarize the region is crazy. And maybe we won't have the solution like that, but we have to look for ideas and try, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yes, Silvia, go ahead.
I just want to add something which kind of goes back to your first question, which was, like, what advice would you give people that want to cover Latin America? And something that you said, I was just at another journalism conference in Spain about migration, and we had wonderful Mexican journalists there speaking about their coverage, but also about what you were just saying, that we need to be very careful of what we ask local journalists to do. Because, as you were saying, we leave, They stay, and they have given us their sources, they have taken us to places, but it's their neighbors who we are exposing as a, drug dealer, and they stay there. So we have to be very, very careful, and not, try, go to Latin America, look like a hero because we're covering this, and then go back to our comfortable homes in Europe, and the local journalist is left there with the dangers. So yeah, I think that's really something that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things to take into account is something that Alejandra said. Many journalists in Latin America are now operating from exile, because it's not safe to practice journalism in their own countries. It happens with Venezuelans, with Nicaraguans, increasingly with people in El Salvador.
And Guatemala.
And Guatemala, of course, where Chepe Zamora has been in jail now for a few months. Turning to something a bit more hopeful, I want to talk a little bit about younger audiences, because obviously Latin America is such a young country. I mean, and we know for a fact that they consume news and journalism in different ways. People younger than the speakers here. So I wanted to ask you, I don't know, whoever wants to start, I mean, the kind of things that you have tried or experimented with in trying to address these kind of audiences. Go.
Maria Teresa told me to go, so I'm going to go. Thank you. So, some data. So, 53% of our listeners, of El Hilo listeners, are between the 24 and 44 bracket. So we have
That's absolutely young.
It's very young.
I'm 43, so
Yes.
I'm happy with that definition.
Yeah, and we've seen that reflected also on social media, which we know that's where they are. So I think, again, you need to, you need to kind of reflect it in your team as well. So we have an engagement team who are not, producing the episodes, but they are producing all the other digital content, which is extremely important. And they're two wonderful, very smart women who know this audience very well. And so I was asking them, what have you done? Do you specifically think about this audience when you create online content? And they said, of course, that's who they're thinking about when they're creating reels on Instagram based on our episodes, or something else that we don't have time to cover. They're thinking of that audience. So they're creating content for them. And something interesting that they were telling me is that it's not just to inform, but also to make content that they feel is useful. So, for example, we did an episode recently about ChatGPT in Latin America, and they created an infographic, kind of like a glossary, like important terms that you need to understand to be able to speak about AI. That was super useful even for me, because, it's not a world that I'm familiar with. And that did really well. Over 200 people saved it on Instagram. So, it's things like that, but it is, knowing where they are, what they consume, and how to reach them, which is very important. So it's not just the audio for us, it's also the digital part is very important.
What do you think, Alejandra? Is there a generational divide in how people consume news?
Yeah, I think it is. It's like some of our investigations are driven for decision makers, and they are not young. Well, some of them, but for us, it's like we are, because we are not a media outlet like that, and we are not publishing breaking news or continuously publishing investigations. Our research may take years, or months at least. But sometimes what we are trying to do to connect with younger audiences is to get partnership with media that already have those audiences. Because we are not going to discover how to connect, we are going to produce the content and then look for an ally that can distribute them, like Vice or AJ Plus, or people that already has those audiences. But yeah, I think that's the thing that we are all trying to discover how to connect better. And for us, we are trying to develop more communities, like small communities of people. Like that's a thing that we're doing in Dromomanos, like to develop small communities in alliance with civil society or academia that work in the issues that we work, like drug policy or democracy, and then start to work with those communities interested, but like not all the young audiences, but young audiences interested in legalization of drugs, or that kind of things, you know?
I think Maria Teresa wants to add something, yeah.
Well, we do a little bit of, like Alejandra was saying, more participation. I think young people, they're no longer passive news consumers. They want to be part of it. Mm-hmm. So we've done calls for proposals, calls for ideas, calls for cartoons, people that can come and participate in one of the investigations, even processing documents, things like that, that we find super useful. We did a very interesting experiment with Mutante from Colombia together with them during the pandemic. We thought a lot about people who were suffering mental illnesses and afflictions because of the pandemic and because of being in closed spaces, and they were under treatments, they couldn't go back, blah, blah, blah. And we did these huge groups of WhatsApp, and then we had an amazing response from a lot of young people who felt really trapped, and we worked with psychologists and all of this, and it came out like a really interesting, beautiful project of people really telling their stories about what was happening to them. And the other big resource is humor.
Of course.
I think people in young audiences love humor, so we have done cartoons about really serious things. and we've worked a lot with Juan Rabel, who's a magnificent Venezuelan producer and comic and journalist in the US. And for example, he's done a wonderful, funny thing about when we covered this information during the pandemic on health issues. Like, he did a wonderful thing, like making fun of all of these guys who were making, because we found there was a German guy making lots of money producing this information during the pandemic. And with that, he did a wonderful cartoon. So that kind of cartoon video, it's very popular, very useful. I mean, it's nothing new, but I think younger people like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, we're going to go to questions very soon, so think about your questions. But before, I want to do a very quick round here about the money, how to finance our journalism. I would like you to explain very briefly how your news organizations are funded, how you manage to do the valuable journalism that you think is worth doing. Maybe Alejandra can start. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have international funding, as everyone, but we are trying...
That means foundations mostly, or...
Yeah, Open Society for Foundation, all those. But we are trying to start developing our own business model for us to start depending less from them. And we have 3 units. One of them is consultancy and communication strategies and impact campaigns for NGOs or academia too, and that's working very well. It's like 30% of our revenue came from that last year, and I think that the idea is to grow that, but it's another area. It's not like what Dromomanos, actually the area is called Dromolab, and it's working. And we are about to launch a membership about training for journalists, for like coaching and workshops, because what we want, and it's also a need, is for better journalism to be done in Spanish. Because there are amazing journalists, amazing media outlets, but like the quality all over the region is not that good. So we want to help that too. And if we can also generate some income with that. And so we are launching that project, this El Salon. And the third unit that we started last year, it's a festival, a journal. Well, it's an ideas festival called Dromofest. You are all invited next year, March 2024. And the idea is to have a commercial strategy for that, for events and other kind of funders. And all the money that we want to do with these 3 units is to continue producing journalism. That's our model.
That's great. Silvia.
Yeah, so Radio Ambulante Studios, which is our production house, is a nonprofit, so also foundations is a part of the budget. But 3 years ago, we created a membership program called the Ambulantes, where listeners can sign up and they choose how much they want to give per month, and they get certain perks. That's 20% of our budget, so it's very important. And actually, that money helped us launch El Hilo, because it was our audience who had asked for another podcast, a more news podcast, and we were able to start it thanks to their support, which was wonderful. And then many of you might know that Radio Ambulante Studios also has an app that helps Spanish language learners, where you can listen to the episode and the transcript is right there, and it moves along with you as you listen, and you can click on words and see the meaning, because again, we saw that we had a lot of listeners who are Spanish language learners, and the revenue that comes from that app is very important. And it's not just an app, it's a way to kind of see a need in your audience, and be able to find funding for that, and then make it something else. So I think that's been a very creative way. And I think something that Radio Ambulante Studios has achieved, which, I mean, when you think of podcasts, you might think of like mattress ads or toothbrush ads, you know, but if you listen to El Hilo, you'll notice that we don't have a lot of that. We don't depend on ads, and that has been really good, and that has been the work of a team that I don't know how they do it, because it takes so much work to be able to fund a project like that.
Yeah, the app is called Lupa, by the way.
Yeah, now it's Jive World. What is it? Jive World Español. It changed recently.
Okay, it changed.
Yeah,
okay,
Jive World Español. But
if you want to learn Spanish, go for that. It's fine. Maria Teresa.
Well, we also depend largely on
Is the other button, I think. Yeah,
I
that
think
one. Yeah.
we also depend largely on grants, but we are now, I think, almost getting 10% of our budget from our own productions, which is workshops, and we do a lot of very specialized, very, especially on OSINT, on open source investigation techniques, which are getting now more and more applications, and more people want to learn this. And this is not just for journalists, it's also for, social leaders and people like that. But the other thing that we are developing, and that's also a little bit, it's taking longer, but it's getting there, is technology. We have a strong technological team, and we are developing some applications very, very useful for investigative journalism. For example, we have developed a platform where you can work completely safely. Everything is encrypted, everything is closed, and it's only for a group of people. And we are sharing it with many of our partners in Latin America, and they appreciate it very much. We call it La Visita. Oh. And then the other one we are developing is that we have this site called, a platform called Nina, which is a data of public sources in Latin America, like public contracting, or lists of people who have been sanctioned, or names of companies and companies' registries, so that you can do investigations across Latin America. So you can put the name of a company and you know if that company is in many countries. Mm-hmm. So we have been developing this for journalists for free, but we are developing also some applications to that. Mm-hmm. So some of our partners are calling us so that we can give them help them develop their own little platforms like Nina, they're little Ninas, and also we develop a new thing called DAPIs, which is you can connect to that platform and compare your data from your computer or your organization to the data in Latin America in public contracting and things like that. It's growing. It still has lots of things to resolve, but that's something we think it's going to be we plan it to be our main source of income technology.
Sounds super, super useful. Well, we go for questions. We still have I think 1 or 2 minutes, but we are going to try to fit at least a couple if they are brief. Here, there's one question here. Oh, sorry, there's one there. Yeah, go ahead. We'll go here later. Go, yeah.
Hi, I'm a journalist from Belgium, and I think Belgium is quite famously hard to get any stories from Latin America commissioned. It seems that the opinion amongst editors is that indeed it's a region that's always in crisis, but never in such a crisis that feels relevant to them. Do you see any underlying reasons why it's so difficult for non-Hispanic European countries to cover Latin America, and what we can do as journalists to get more stories in our media outlets as well?
Anyone wants to take that one?
I didn't hear that.
Can you summarize? Yeah. Can you summarize the question?
Yes.
Speaking a bit louder. Yeah.
Sorry, we couldn't hear you very well because there's a lot of echo here.
That's fine. Shortened. Do you see any underlying reasons why it's so difficult for countries such as Belgium, the Netherlands, France, to cover Latin America, to get stories commissioned and published? Because there's not a lot of appetite amongst editors to do so.
Okay.
And do you know how to push through the barrier?
Anyone wants to take that? Maria Teresa, go for it. Yeah.
I think there's a problem with history. It's very difficult to solve. Which is actually, Latin America is interesting for Spain because we have a history together. There's a connection. Africa is more interesting probably to many countries in Europe who were colonizers of Africa, and so there's connections there. There's something they care for, they know, they've grown with. And of course, the English world only cares about the English world, the speaking in English. And then from our point of view of Latin America, we have this humongous wealth, which is Spanish. And so we really don't make a lot of effort to go and try to be published in other languages or whatever, because you can get how many? I don't know, 300, 400 million people who can actually read your stories in Spanish. So why would you bother to go and try to have them read in French or whatever? So I'm being a little bit facetious here, but I do think that that's a lot of the difficulty, that the audiences in Belgium or in France, unless there's something really outstanding or something that connects to their own feelings. And editors know that, so that's difficult to get for example, now the Raphael story was played big in France because it was a French group, Forbidden, but
stories.
Also because it's an emotional thing. There is
emotion always connects. That's
and then also the fact that some of the coal that was exported in the region where Raphael was killed was exported to the Netherlands. So then the Netherlands gets interested. So you would have to find what would interest that country to be able to make the connection. Because as a general rule, I think there are communities of interest that it's difficult to cross around them.
Let's go for a final question over there because it's time now almost to finish. Go. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for all your comments. It's been super helpful. My name is Josephine and I work on Africa Podfest. And one of the main areas that I keep being asked about is how can I get more Spanish language content that's relevant to countries that have English, French, Portuguese, that as their main languages in Africa. So there are countries where, for example, in Angola, they ask us for content that's relevant and kind of connected. And I couldn't help but wonder, if there's some good examples of collaborations with different regions where it's not part of the 300 million, but it's a sizable, chunk on the western side of Africa. We have that example. So I hope that's a little bit short for the end. Thank you.
To be honest, I don't know of many global projects. It's like something that we definitely are interested in, but we haven't done it before because it's like Latin America is like a really new concept, as Maria Teresa was saying. It's a history thing. It's like, I think that 100 years ago people start talking about Latin America, and now we are starting to look at each other as a region and to consider ourselves like that. So to look like, and I think that's something that the future will come to happen with Africa, because we are facing the same troubles. We are facing colonialism. We are facing racism. It's like we are having the same things. We are facing drug trafficking. The roots are really similar. What happens in Brazil and what happens with Guinea Equatorial is really similar. So I think we have to have those kind of projects and to start, like, these kind of places are great to meet people, to start working with this kind of collaborations.
Great. Well, we are totally out of time. I really hope that you have learned so much about Latin America as I have done. And please join me, thanking these wonderful, wonderful speakers. Thank you all.
Thank you.